So I mentioned yesterday that you could use Bootstrap validation to perform your client-side validation. And I thought I'd take a few minutes today to go over how to do that. Now, if you go into the Bootstrap documentation, you look under Forms, and you go down to Validation, you'll find out more information about how this works. One of the first things I need to do to set this up is to add some JavaScript is actually where I'm going to start. The way that they're writing this is in vanilla JavaScript, but I'd like to convert this over to jQuery. So if I kind of read through the example code that they provide, the first thing I see is that they're adding an event listener to load. If you remember, the load event is kind of similar to our ready. So if I was going to convert that, well, that would go in here. The next thing I see is that they're getting all of the forms that have this needs validation class. Okay, well, I can do that with jQuery using a selector. So that would be equivalent to starting out like so. And I might say form.needs validation. That would be my selector. If I look at the next thing that they do, they're doing this loop, array.prototype filter call, and effectively what they're doing is they're looping over each form and calling a function. And we can do that in jQuery a lot quicker than what's happening here. Because if you remember right, jQuery already pulls back all the elements that match that selector, and we can quickly add a submit event. They're adding a submit event to each of those forms. So I can do that with a lot less code using jQuery, and it would kind of look like this. So I say, take all the forms that have the needs validation class, and then we want to say when they are submitted, we want to handle that. Now, the key ingredient in here is what you find down on this section here. So the first thing we need to do is check if the form is valid, and they have added this check validity method to the form objects themselves. So we can call that, and we can say if form, I need the form variable, which I don't have right now, that would actually be EVT target. So I could say EVT target dot check validity. Okay, and then they compared that to false. I could do that as well, but I'm going to simply say, is it falsy? So if it's not valid, then we want to do some logic. So the logic they do specifically is they say prevent the default behavior and stop propagation. Spell it correctly. And then the last thing that they do, regardless of whether or not it passes the validity check, is they add a class to the form. In this case, I do need to wrap it in a jQuery wrapper because I want to refer to a jQuery method, whereas this was a method on the DOM element itself. So here I want to say add class, and we're going to add the class was validated. So that class will then end up showing whether or not the field is valid. Until you add that class, you won't actually see any of the results. So if I take the JavaScript code that is provided and turn it into jQuery, this is the equivalent in jQuery. Now, what we can see what's happening with this to kind of look it over, I can see that I'm hooking up a submit event handler for all of the forms that have the needs validation class, which that kind of points to the fact that when we want to use this logic, we'll need to give that form that class in order to trigger this logic. And then I'm saying, well, let's check the validity. If it's not valid, we'll prevent default and stop propagation. And either way, we're going to add the wasValidated class to the form. So that's the bit of JavaScript code that you need to have in there to support the Bootstrap validation. Now let's look at how I can actually add in the parts to implement that. Because if I just have that logic in there, let's say I go and try to add a product, we'll see that nothing happens yet. So there's some additional changes I need to make to the view. So the first thing I need to do is on the form, I need to add the class needs validation. I also need to add the Boolean attribute noValidate. Will prevent the default browser validation from kicking in because we're going to let Bootstrap do the validation instead. If we try to use the form now, we'll see that the Bootstrap checks are occurring, but you'll notice all the fields are still being marked as valid. That's because I haven't given any sort of constraints or any sort of criteria that the fields need to match. So what I need to do is go through each of the input elements and add a few constraints. So first, for the name field, I need to tell the browser that it is required. Second, I need to tell it that it has a minimum length, and also add a maximum length of 100. That's going to mean that user has to enter a name that is at least 3 characters long, but no more than 100 characters. We can do the same thing with the category. So under the category, I'm going to say that the category is required, that the minimum length is 3, and that the maximum length is 7. Similarly, for the number input, I also need to specify some constraints there. We've already started some of them for that, but I need to add a few more. So I need to say that this field is required. I've already said that the minimum price is 0. I've said that the step is 0.1, but I have not set a maximum, which you'll remember we set a maximum on the back end. So our maximum here would be 9999.99. And that keeps the front end and the back end in sync in regards to those constraints. Let's refresh the page and try it now. So what you'll see is that all of the fields are red, but I don't necessarily have a meaningful message yet to explain why are they invalid. I need to add an element, specifically a div here, with the class of Invalid Feedback. So I'm actually going to pull the class out that I have here, that div. I'm going to put in a new div with the ID of Invalid Feedback. Within there, I need to specify the message that I would like to appear. So in this case, the message is going to be, please enter a name that is at least 3 characters long, like so. Similarly, for the category, I want to say that the category has to be at least 3 characters long. So I'll replace the error I already have with that. Invalid feedback, please enter a category that is at least 3 characters long. And the error I'm going to spit out for the price is I'm just going to say, please enter a valid price. Okay. So those are my error messages, and you'll see each of those have simply just the class of invalid feedback. Okay, let's try it again. And now you'll see for each of these fields that we're now getting a descriptive message that tells the user a little bit more about maybe what's going on and highlights those fields that are invalid. You'll notice that the default behavior once I start typing is it'll change it to green with a check mark. but I might want to also add a message beneath that. The way that I add a message for when it's valid, you'll notice I have invalid feedback already. I can add a valid feedback div. Okay, so this one will appear if the field is valid. So if I try to work with it again, submit it, start typing, you'll see that it switches to green and it shows this message looks good. So in general, I'll usually add both an invalid feedback message and a valid feedback message for each of these fields. Now that I've got that, we can submit it and we can test to see if this is working. So if I say test product, okay, is the name, it likes that. Other is the category, it's happy there. And I might put in the price as $199. All right, let's hit save, and we see that goes through. Now, one of the things you may have noticed along the way, you may notice that this message is coming up all the time. Now that message, remember, is coming from the server, which means that this logic here is not actually preventing it from running our other handler. So it's actually running this handler first, and then also running our logic that we've implemented for sending the AJAX request. So oftentimes, rather than maybe doing it this way, I may have to actually embed this, at least the logic parts that I need, into the individual handler to check the validity and add the appropriate class. So if I add that in here, I would say evt.target. Let's add that class of what was validated. And make sure that always gets added when you try to submit the form. And I want to say, well, if it's not valid, which would be evt target dot check validity. So if that fails, then I want to immediately return. So that's the logic that I need to put into this specific handler to avoid it from sending the AJAX request. So now we have it, and you'll see that the message down here doesn't get displayed because it's not actually doing the submit if there's a problem with the front end validation. So now we have a fully working add product page. I can do the same changes to the product edit page. I'll need to take this check here to add the was validated class as well as checking validity, and add that to this form as well. Now I'm going to go to product edit 21. And in the handlebars view, you'll remember, what do I need to do? Well, first things I need to do is add to the form, just like I did with the other one. So I want to add class needs validation. Add the no validate Boolean attribute. And then I need to go through each of these fields, and similar to how we set them up on the add product page, I need to give them constraints. So for the name, I'm going to give it the same constraints. It's required. It's got a minimum length of 3 and a maximum length of 100. For the category, again, it's got, it is required, has a minimum length of 3, maximum length of 7. And for the price, I'm going to remove these two attributes here, the min and the step. So the price is required, minimum of 0, maximum of 99999, and a step or 1 cent. Okay, So I've added those in, and then remember I still need to add the invalid feedback and valid feedback messages. I'm going to actually put the same messages here that I had on my ad page. Okay. Save that there, go back to my view. So if I leave out one of these fields, you can see that it checks that these are valid, but this one's not. I can remove the values from all those, and now you'll see that I have errors on each of the fields. Great. If I were to say refresh the page, leave it all good in here, and hit save, you'll see that it briefly flashes with saying that's look good before it returns here. So that's really all you have to do to get Bootstrap to provide some better client-side validation for your form before you submit it. And that's it. I'll see you in the next session. Bye.